program is provided without charge by Reformed Theological Seminary, which reserves all rights. To learn how you can support RTS, please visit give.rts.edu.
So we are now done with the section on manuscripts, or the section on P66, I should say. So a little excursion into the Greek readings. I hope that was interesting and helpful for you as an introduction. Now we're going to resume where we left off with the prior structure of the class and the lectures we're in. And let me just remind us where we are. We're working our way through in detail the attributes of canonicity. We've already covered divine qualities and apostolic origins. And on each of those, we didn't just dive deeper into those concepts, but we explored potential defeaters. Maybe it's the belief that you have forgeries in the New Testament, pseudonymous works, or for divine qualities, the idea that we can't have divine qualities in a book that contradicts itself, right? That's diverse theologically. So we looked at those potential defeaters. Now we come to the third of the attributes of canonicity, and that is corporate reception. Now remember, this is our claim that the unanimity of the church around these books is a meaningful guide and a reliable guide to which books are canonical. Now, you don't have to know anything about the history of the canon, really, to have that particular attribute. You just simply need to know that the church is coalesced around these books. And therefore, if you know the church is coalesced around these books and the church is a reliable indicator of canonicity, then you have your answer. But this has been challenged. Corporate reception has been challenged as a meaningful indicator of canonicity. So here's where we come to the defeater of defeaters, or the better put, the ultimate defeater, supposedly, from the critic's side. And this is the most commonly leveled defeater against not only my model, but just the Christian belief in canon as a whole. And so what I want to do is talk about this defeater and talk about how we're going to respond to it. Because for the rest of the class, pretty much, we're going to spend our time responding to this particular defeater. All right, so what is this defeater? This defeater has to do with what we're calling canonical diversity, is my language here. Canonical diversity simply refers to the disagreements, the chaos, the anarchy, the problematic journey that the canon had in the earliest centuries of the church. In other words, what the critics want to say is the final consensus on the canon is not the whole story. Final consensus on the canon comes on the heels of a great bit of chaos in the early church, so the critics say. This chaos is so significant, so widespread, so much disagreement. No one knew what books to read. There was all kinds of debates and problems, and it was only until the 4th century or 5th century that there was any kind of a consensus. And it seems to be a forced consensus at best, say the critics, where your hand is sort of forced, and it was not really a reliable indicator of what books are canonical. So the essence of the canonical diversity defeater, then, is that the church consensus is irrelevant. The church consensus is artificial. The church consensus is not meaningful because it came on the heels of so much disagreement. How then could it be a reliable indicator of what books are canonical? So the argument goes. Now, this is by far and away the most common objection made to this model and to any, like I said, any belief in the canon. And this is where critics have sort of piled on all their effort, which is to show how much canonical diversity there really was in early Christianity. Now, how are we going to respond to this? What's going to be our defeater? Well, we're going to do this in two ways, and you can see it there in your outline. We're going to have a twofold response to this defeater. A more brief response and then a very lengthy response. So first, we want to point out in response, first of all, that the canonical diversity defeater only works if a certain assumption is made. In fact, there's an assumption made but never actually articulated. There's an assumption made that no one ever actually says outright, but it's built into the objection and kind of slipped in the back door without anyone noticing. And what is that assumption? That assumption is that if God had really given the canon, there wouldn't be this kind of disagreement. The assumption is that disagreement is inconsistent with the self-authenticating model. That if the Bible was really self-authenticating, if God was really behind this, if the Spirit was really at work, we really wouldn't have disagreements. We would have harmony. In fact, almost near immediate consensus at the very beginning, and hardly any objections. And only then could you be sure that you really have God's books. And if you don't have that, if you don't have that level of unanimity and consensus, then something must be wrong and you must not have the right book. So notice the argument actually has that built-in assumption. It's not just the argument that diversity and disagreement mean you can't rely on the church's consensus, but that diversity and disagreement is inconsistent with and contradictory to God at work in the process at all. Now, as you might anticipate, we're going to challenge that head on. And by the way, the argument doesn't work unless you have that component. It has to be that canonical diversity is a problem, and the canonical diversity is a problem if it's contrary to what you would expect if the model were true. If the self-authenticating model is true, the critics want to make it sound like if the self-authenticating model is true, you would have had immediate consensus right out of the bat, right out of the gate. And since you don't, therefore the canonical model must not be true. But we're going to challenge that assumption. We're going to say, where is it in our model that says you have to have immediate consensus right out of the gate? There's no sense that that's our expectations. So we're going to challenge that. I think that's a major problem. And then we're going to offer a second defeater. A second thing we're going to do over the rest of this class is argue that the extent of diversity is not near what the critics claim. In other words, we're going to defeat the defeater by saying that there really isn't the level of diversity you say there is. Now, I got to say on the surface that if the critics were right, if their rhetoric was consistent with the facts, they might have a case. If it was so bad, so disorganized, and so chaotic, and everybody read something different, and no one got along until the 5th century, and someone kind of forced it, well, then you could say, maybe you got a point there. But we're going to spend a lot of time in this class showing that the canonical situation in the early church was, in fact, not that chaotic. Was there diversity? Yes. Was there disagreement? Of course. And we're going to argue, of course, as already indicated, that we should expect some of that. But not near to the extent that the critics want to insist upon. So let me just repeat again where we're going from here so everyone knows. Remember, what we're dealing with is the corporate reception of the church, and the defeater is simply that too much disagreement, too much canonical diversity means you can't rely on that attribute. We're going to offer a response to that, and our response is going to be twofold. First, we're going to push back against the built-in assumption there that somehow disagreement is inconsistent with the model. We don't think that's the case. And then secondly, we're going to push back on the extent of this disagreement and how vast and how wide and how big, in fact, it was. The first of those will be relatively brief, and the second will be the entire rest of the class. Okay? So that's where we're going from here. So let's start with the first of our defeaters, which is correcting this idea of expectations, getting our expectations straight. As I've already said, built into the canonical diversity defeater is the assumption that we can only believe we have the writings God intended if we have few or hardly any dissenters. Now, here's what I'll observe about this defeater, is that sadly many Christians agree with it. Let me just explain what I mean by this. The non-Christian critic is making the case that if you have a lot of disagreement, then God can't be in it. Or if you have a lot of disagreement, then you can't rely on the church's consensus or something along these lines. That if the model were really true, you wouldn't have all these disagreements. That's the critical claim. What I want to suggest to you is that most Christians already agree with that claim before it's even made, which is the unfortunate thing I want to counteract. In my experience, and again, it's just anecdotal, the Christians I talk to, even seminary students I talk to, they themselves have the expectation that the canon should have been smooth, that it should have been kind of easy peasy, over and out within the 1st century. They have the sense that, golly, if these books are really from God and God's really at work and the Spirit's true and these books are inspired, this should have been a slam dunk. So unfortunately, even believers already go in with bad expectations about what canonical diversity would be. They think that if you have some, then we're in big trouble. I kind of wonder where that comes from. I suppose we could speculate. I think it probably comes from a relatively naive picture of the way God works in history, or maybe an overly simplistic picture of biblical authority or the way God unfolded the canon. Maybe it just comes from a desire that we want things to be super neat and tidy all the time, and if we feel better when they are. I don't know all the reasons. Like I said, we could do a little bit of a cultural and psychological analysis on why Christians think that. But I want to suggest to you that there's no reason to think that. In fact, on the contrary, we should be expecting disagreement and diversity. It should be something we anticipated. It should be something that would have been natural. In fact, what's shocking in the early centuries isn't the level of diversity. What's shocking is how much unity there was at a very early time. And we're going to see that unity in a moment. Or let me put it a different way. I think Christians are shocked by the wrong thing in the early church. They're shocked by the fact that there's any disagreement, when they should be shocked by how much unity there was, even in the midst of that disagreement, and how that unity was there very early. I'm a little disappointed, honestly, that more Christians aren't shocked by the correct thing. They should be shocked that there was so much unity so early, instead of shocked that there was any disagreement. I'm like, what world are you living in? Are you not living in a fallen world? Are you not living in a world where sin is cursed? Are you not living in a world where the church isn't a perfect place? Are you not living in a world where there's disagreement and conflict? What world are you in that you think, when God gives canonical books, that there's instantaneous reception, overnight, everybody's on the same page? Can you tell me any other time in church history where that's been true? It's like almost like this utopian view of the church, that it should have been this way, and if it's not, then it's all bets are off. What if someone made that argument about Jesus for a moment? What if someone said, if he really was the Son of God, there would have been instantaneous agreement across the board? If Jesus was really the divine Messiah, then everybody would have been on the bandwagon instantaneously. If Jesus was really the Son of God, there would have been no conflict. Can you imagine how stupid this argument sounds? I mean, you know how dumb this sounds, even as I make it. Who thinks such a thing? But what if someone argued that, well, if there's a lot of disagreement over Jesus, he must not be the Son of God? You're like, no. Even if he's the Son of God, even if he's fully obviously the Son of God, even if he's blatantly the Son of God, and all the evidence is there, you're still going to have all this disagreement. So here's Jesus, comes to Israel, comes to God's people, and he's widely rejected. And what if he used the same argument and said, well, golly, I guess he must not be Lord? That makes no sense at all. So why is it that we don't think that way when it comes to someone like Jesus? When it comes to the canon, it should be this pristine affair. So we need to get our expectations straight here. And I would suggest to you that this sort of built-in assumption is not only something that the critics have, but it's something that Christians have. And this is why our job when it comes to the canon is a lot harder than people think, because we have to sort of deprogram what they're expecting and then reprogram it rightly. Now, I don't have time to go through all the examples in the critical scholarly world of how they always just point out disagreements as evidence there can't be a canon, or that you can't rely on the church's consensus and so on. It just goes on and on and on. And I'll leave you to my book for some examples of that. But let me offer here, though, why I think we should expect disagreement and why this isn't inconsistent with our model. And if we can show that, then we already have defeated, in my opinion, a large part of this defeater. We've offered a good defeater. So let's just walk through some ways, and you can see it there in your notes, the ways the self-authenticating model expects some disagreement. Number one, the Scriptures warn of false teachers and false teaching. If you've had Hebrews to read with me, you know that it's everywhere, in particularly that part of the corpus, that the church is going to face people who have wrong beliefs inside the church. In the church, there's going to be false teachers. Inside the church, there's people who have wrong views. Not just the world out there who gets things wrong, but inside the church, there's going to be people who are leading others astray, believing wrong things. Even in the age of the New Covenant, even in the age of the Spirit, even in the age of Jesus' resurrection, even in the age of all the optimistic things we think about this new period of time that God has ushered in, even then, false teachers will abound, they will lead the church astray, and they will come from within. Now, just on this first point, are we to think that none of that false teaching will have to do with which books are God's and which books aren't? And why would we think that that false teaching is only restricted to things like Christology or pneumatology or ecclesiology or whatever else you would think of? Could that false teaching not also include which books are God's books and which aren't? It seems to me that there's a sense in which that is a very obvious point that needs to be reckoned with. And remember, when the Scriptures make that warning about false teachers, it's not just a recognition of false teachers in the present, it's a warning about false teachers in the future. What does Paul warn the Ephesian church against? About wolves that will come in the future and destroy the flock. You should be on watch for such things because they're going to happen. So that's the first thing. Second reason we should expect disagreement and diversity is we know that it's not just false teachers that are a problem, but we have spiritual forces opposing the church. We know that Satan is active. We know that the demonic forces are looking to deceive, trick, and derail the church. We would expect that that kind of demonic activity would lead to schism, and it would lead to sort of sharp disagreements and the parting of the ways, and Christians fighting Christians. Would we expect none of that to affect the canon? So if Satan is at work trying to turn the church on herself, and he's at work trying to cause trouble, would we not expect some of that to be successful? Not completely. Of course, not fully successful, not in the end triumphant successful, but yet still causing havoc? Of course. Third thing is the possibility of the resistance to the Spirit. We've already argued that the Spirit at work in the church and the divine qualities of the books gives us reason for expecting a predominant or general unanimity around these books. But at the same time, there is the ability we know in Scripture to resist the Spirit, to not listen to God, to stubbornly refuse to follow the Spirit's lead. Would we not expect that that would happen in some parts of the church or with some individuals? Now, we would argue that theologically God is going to preserve His church in such a way that that level of resistance to the Spirit doesn't take over the church, which is why we argued for what we called a predominant unity around these books. But why would we be surprised about some disunity around these books? But then the fourth part here that is really, I think, the key defeater here, and one that is hardly ever mentioned, is not all groups who claim to be Christians or claim to be the church are part of it. I'm going to pause on this for a moment, because if you don't get this, you're going to miss one of our major counter-arguments. Here's what Bart Ehrman does in his books. He says, look at all this disagreement over the canon. And he'll list out all the people who disagree. Look at the Marcionites, they have their books. The Ebionites, they have their books. The Gnostics, they have their books. The Valentinians, they have their books. So, and you could just mention these different books. You know, they've got an edited Luke. They probably got the Gospel of the Hebrews. The Gnostics or maybe have Thomas. Let's just say that for the sake of it, even though there's dispute about that. And Valentinus, maybe the Gospel of Truth. Wow, looks like a lot of diversity. Now you can see how on the surface you could look at this long list and go, man, I mean, it's just not objectionable. I mean, look at all these different groups with all these different books. Isn't this an example of diversity? Here's a little sleight of hand that happens here in this conversation, though, is that Ehrman refers to each of these groups as Christians. He says, well, look, Christians disagree with other Christians. Some Christians believe the Gospel of Thomas. Some Christians read the Gospel of Hebrews. Some Christians read an edited Luke. Some Christians read the Gospel of Truth. All of them are Christians, and they can't get along. Don't miss what's going on here. There's a nomenclature move here that's very deceptive that you need to be aware of. Do we have a reason to think that these are true Christians? Now, I know what Ehrman's response is going to be. He's going to be like, look, it's not our place to judge. If a person says they follow Christ and they follow Christ, they must be a Christian, right? And it sounds very pious on one level to say, look, you know, who are we to go in and adjudicate who a true Christian is? You can't do that. If they say they're a follower of Jesus, they're a follower of Jesus. But you and I know that's very deceptive, because some of the beliefs of these groups are so wacko that they can't even remotely be considered Christian beliefs. And let me just go down the list. I mean, the Marcionites is a great example of this. The Marcionites, again, don't believe the Old Testament is the Word of God. Was that a Christian belief? No, they're crazy in the minority there. And they don't believe that the God of the Old Testament is the true God. They don't believe the created world was made by the true God. They believe the created world is evil. They believe that it was a false God, a demiurge that made the world. They believe that you go down to the Gnostics and the Valentinians. You know what they are? They believe in multiple gods. They're polytheistic. They're not even monotheistic. They don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God in the same way, do they? They believe he's an angel, part of a pantheon of a range of divine beings. And they don't believe in the Old Testament. They don't believe the one creator God. They don't believe any of the things that's the basis of what you would call Christian. It's not remotely Christian. So, how much concern should we have about groups that aren't even really Christian saying things that disagree with Christianity, even though they claim the name? Is that really an example of canonical diversity? See, this is where I think you need to fix that. I don't think that's at all an example of canonical diversity. I think it's an example of a group that's not a Christian group, claiming crazy things. The equivalent would be, and I said this before, I think yesterday, the equivalent argument would be, you Christians today can't agree on which books are in the canon. And you might go, what? Well, yeah, we do. We all agree. And go, no, you don't. The Mormons don't have the same books you do. They're Christians. What if someone made that argument? You'd be like, what? Yeah, well, Mormons claim to be Christians, but Mormons aren't Christians. And since Mormons aren't Christians, the fact that they hold the Book of Mormon is not an argument against unity within Christendom. But if someone goes, well, since they claim to be Christians, they must be Christians. That's nuts. You wouldn't buy that argument. But that's the argument they're making about ancient Christianity. Is the Spirit at work in these people? Not if they're not believers. So why should their beliefs about books be compelling to us as evidence of disagreement? I'll give you another example of the equivalent this would be in the modern day. I don't know if you guys remember the back in the 90s, I think the guy's name was Applewhite. I got all these names in my head. His name was Applewhite, though. There's a guy in the mid-90s, this is probably before some of you would have noticed such things, that led a fringe cult that all committed suicide. What's the name of that group? They believed they were going to get taken away by a UFO. Someone help me. The Hale-Bopp Comet Group. Marshall Applewhite, yes. Yeah, Heaven's Gate, thank you, yes. But Marshall Applewhite was the leader of a group called the Heaven's Gate in the early 90s, who was a cult group that believed that a UFO would come and take everybody away. And if you commit suicide, that's a good thing because it'll help you get taken away by the UFO. And there's a mass suicide, right? It was very big news in the day about this mass suicide. It was kind of the Jim Jones of the 1990s, if you're familiar with the Jim Jones mass suicide in the 60s or 70s, or I think it was the 70s, whenever that was, where they drank all the poisonous Kool-Aid or whatever. So imagine that this headline appears in the paper the next day. Christians believe in suicide and UFOs. And you'd be like, what? Christians don't believe in that. And then the reporter defends their argument, or their article by saying, well, Marshall Applewhite claimed to be a Christian. Marshall Applewhite claimed to be a prophet of Jesus. He believed that he was going to be saved by Jesus and go meet Jesus in the sky and so on. So yes, that's what Christians believe. Now, if you heard that, you'd be like, what? No. There is not a disagreement within Christendom over whether suicide is good. There is not a disagreement in Christendom over whether we're going to get taken away by UFOs. That's a fringe group that claims to be Christian that isn't. Therefore, you can't use that as an example of what Christians believe with any integrity at all, right? This is what we're going to argue here. We're going to say, look, the supposed diversity you're pointing out is not reasonable evidence of diversity actually within Christianity. So this is an important rebuttal here to the defeater. And this is our defeater about expectations. Now, once you take all those things into consideration, you've got false teachers, spiritual forces opposing the church, people who resist the Spirit, the fact that not all Christians claim to be Christians, so a level of diversity isn't there. You should expect some, but that doesn't count as legitimate. All of that is suggestive of the fact that you would expect some level of disagreement, even within the larger sort of a core Christian world. So the fact that some exists at all is not at all inconsistent with our model. And I'll add another one on top of this that's not in your notes that I think adds to a layer of disagreement. It's simply this, that God in His providence decided to give the canon through normal historical processes. Here's what I mean by that, is that when God delivered the canon to His people, He didn't, as I joked in an earlier lecture, deliver the canon from heaven on golden tablets, all nice and tidy for His people. What did He do? He delivered the canon through normal historical channels, normal being through human authors and human circumstances who write on a piece of paper with a quill, and that gets copied and passed around, and other people learn about it, and then they receive those books. This standard historical process, God decided to use that process to bring the canon to bear. And once you say that, once you realize God brought the books about through that process, you realize that process has certain inefficiencies about it. Here's an example of an inefficiency. One book is known in one part of the empire before it's ever even heard of in another part of the empire. So one other part of the empire might say, I don't know that book. I don't recognize that book as the Word of God because they don't have yet had time with it or exposure to it. Different books are written in different times, different continents, different geographical locales. It takes time for the dust to settle on these types of things. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to realize that this would have been a process. So when you say, look, it took a while for Christians to figure this out, we're like, well, yeah, part of the reason is these things we've already mentioned, but the other part of the reason is because God just gave it through normal historical channels. You didn't have an internet where you could just post it online and everyone look at it and then the same day, have knowledge of these things. It would have taken time for things like this to be passed down over time. Okay, so what we want to say here is that you should expect some disagreement within Christendom, and this is going to get at the defeater. Now, in your notes there, you can see one other thing we need to bring up here, and what about the Old Testament Apocrypha? This is usually used also as part of the same defeater, which is that, see, your model doesn't work because look at all the disagreement that happened in the Old Testament canon between Roman Catholics and Protestants. Therefore, your argument can't work. Now, I kind of answered this in a prior lecture, but given what we know so far, let me turn this back to you. How would you react? How would you respond to that? Does disagreement between Roman Catholics and Protestants over the Old Testament Apocrypha violate our model?
The Apocrypha didn't come until later, right? Like after the canon's already established.
Right. So one thing we'd point out is that when you look at the Old Testament people of God, namely Israel, they did coalesce with unity around the Old Testament books. And it wasn't until later, arguably in the Middle Ages and beyond, that there was a glitch here with the Old Testament Apocrypha. Okay? So we'd argue that the system worked, quote unquote, in the stages it should have, which is when the Old Testament Israel received these books. So that would be one response.
So the church in the Middle Ages is actually Christians or true church?
Yeah, I mean, this sounds very uncharitable, and I'm not trying to be overly uncharitable, but should we put Catholicism on this list? I mean, you get to a point where you have to ask whether a church is the true church or an apostate church, right? It's interesting, the Reformers were convinced that the Roman Catholic Church, they were kind of mixed on this, but the true church on one level, but had left the reservation on another level. Is their opinion about books kind of like these groups' opinion about books? Or is it a legitimate issue of spirit-filled people disagreeing? It's a complicated question, isn't it? There's other things I say in my book along these lines that help respond to the claims that the Old Testament Apocrypha disagreement shoots our model down, but I don't think so. I think at the end of the day, what this shows is we would expect some level of disagreement, but it's not going to be near as big as people think it would be. Now, before we leave this particular section, let me just mention something positive about disagreements here. Point B, a positive perspective on disagreements. This is something that I don't think really gets said enough, which I think is interesting, is that to some extent, we should remember that disagreements amongst Christians in the early centuries aren't necessarily detrimental to the church. We kind of get this idea that if there's disagreement, that's always bad. And maybe you feel like this about your church, and some types of disagreement certainly would be bad at your church, in my church. But is disagreement always a negative for the health of a church? What might a positive result of this sort of disagreement and dialogue cause for a church? I mean, even think of your own if you need to. How might we see it positively? When you operate independently, you might have one view, but when you operate corporately, sometimes your view changes, right? Or sometimes it's the interactions with your brothers and sisters that help sharpen you and shape you. What else does disagreement make you do with your view? Express it more carefully. Study it, investigate it, do your homework more than you otherwise would have. Think about it. If you're going into a meeting in a session and you assume everyone's going to agree with you, how much are you really preparing? You got an easy vote here. If you go into a session meeting and you know there's going to be disagreement in advance, what are you going to do? You're going to do your homework, right? Here's what I want you to see about disagreements in the early church, is that we may be catching the church as it grows up here, okay? Where people make comments and people have disagreements and people have opinions that just aren't well thought through because the church is growing up. It's coalescing, it's maturing. And as it meets together, talks together, works it out, of course they're going to reach conclusions that are more mature than the conclusions they meet when they're more separate. So I think there is some validity to saying what the church eventually coalesced around is very meaningful, even if in her earlier stages she was kind of scattered a little bit. Although, as we'll argue, not near as much as the skeptics suggest. It's kind of like, again, the analogy of people having different agreements. I mean, imagine it on a session if you ended up agreeing as a session to do something, and someone raised their hand and goes, well, that agreement doesn't count because all of you disagreed last week before you went into that meeting, and therefore this consensus is false. It doesn't have any meaning. No, I didn't count. What kind of argument is that? It's because you might have earlier disagreements. Doesn't mean that your later disagreements or that your later agreement is irrelevant. Moreover, I'm convinced that when the early church disagreed over books, think 2nd century, 3rd century, that it forced them to analyze those books at a much more intricate level. And here's what we see. We see the church fathers going over these books with a fine-tooth comb. They are historically, critically, textually analyzing them. Why should that be reassuring? It should be reassuring because it helps us take seriously their consensus. After all that study, after all that analysis, after all that careful scrutiny, these books still prove themselves to be true. I mean, couldn't you make the opposite argument? That if the church quickly coalesced around these books with no real disagreements and no real lengthy process and no real thought, couldn't you say that it was a bit jumping the gun? Couldn't you say, yeah, well, they all agreed in the first century about these books, but no one had really ever studied them yet. There wasn't really a thoughtful process. It was all too fast. Here's the thing about critical scholarship. Sometimes you feel like you can't win either way, right? If the canon takes a long time, well, that's invalid. If a canon's too short, well, that's invalid. It's like you can't win. I would suggest to you that if it was quick and easy, there would be arguments against that too. I think the process in the early church is something that we should be encouraged by. They did disagree at times. They worked through it. They studied these books. They reassessed their ideas and their views. They came together and they reached a consensus. Why would we dismiss that consensus as irrelevant? I suppose the only way you could make that claim is if you tried to argue the consensus as some, forced, militant, kind of politically doctored consensus. So now you got to go to the tiresome trope of Constantine forcing everybody to accept just his books, and that's silliness. And that just doesn't hold for a bunch of other reasons we can't get into here. But short of that, I don't know why you would think the consensus, or why a person would think the consensus is invalid simply because there were prior stages of disagreement. We could turn the table on our critical scholar friends. You ever notice how much critical scholarship disagrees with one another? What if we said, oh, your so-called consensus in critical scholarship about whatever issue it might be, what if we just turn the tables on them with the same argument and go, yeah, well, you got a so-called critical consensus now, but if you look back in history, you guys couldn't agree on anything. Therefore, your consensus is rubbish. What if you did that to critical scholars? They would say, no, our consensus is worth something. Why? Because it's born out of all these years of debate and analysis and struggle. And because it was born out of all this debate, analysis, and struggle, you can trust the consensus because it comes after a lot of thoughtfulness. So yes, our critical scholarly consensus is meaningful, they would say. But I'm like, aren't they doing the same thing we're doing there? So it is ironic that they would chide Christians for believing in the consensus of the church when they have the same phenomenon happen in their own guild. Where does this leave us? This leaves us with, I think, a very valid defeater, which is the claim that canonical diversity is inconsistent with the model doesn't hold. We would expect canonical diversity. Of course there should be canonical diversity. Why wouldn't there be? It is going to take a while to work it out. Of course there's going to be a long, drawn-out process. That fits with the model perfectly fine. There's nothing inconsistent about that with their model. And again, as we've already indicated, and this was a bit of a jumping the gun to our next point, the level of disagreement isn't going to be near what people say it's going to be when you consider the things that we've already brought up about what really counts as a Christian view anyway, things like this. Okay, so this is our first part of our defeater. We're saying, look, you're saying that canonical diversity disproves our view. Actually, it doesn't. Now, the second thing we're going to do, and we're getting ready to start in just a moment, is we're going to argue that the diversity wasn't near as big as our critics want to suggest. We want to say, yes, there was diversity, but within a certain range, within a certain limit. It wasn't all-encompassing and overwhelming. For those of you who are, well, all of you are going to be in ministry trying to reassure someone in your congregation over this issue. And this point we just covered is really important. One really helpful question to ask them is, well, what would you expect it to be like if God were at work in the process of Canon? I mean, what do you think is a reasonable expectation about how it would have gone? Just hear what they say. And if they give you the pristine church speech, you can just gently push back on that and go, well, look, is it really reasonable to think that would be the case? What if we applied that to Jesus' divinity and said, well, only if there's universal agreement, then could we believe he's really divine? Well, that's crazy. You wouldn't use that argument for hardly anything, and you certainly aren't going to use it for the canon.
The preceding program has been brought to you by Reformed Theological Seminary and may not be reproduced or disseminated in part or in whole for sale or for profit without express written consent. For more information on RTS degrees and programs, please visit us at www.rts.edu or call 1-855-854-6920.